Let's recap what's been covered in the first and second part of this documentary series before moving on. We've been focusing mainly on the music industry, and in part one, I did my best to prove the point that our modern entertainment industry exists almost for the sole purpose of social indoctrination and just to desensitize us, from morality and from moral righteousness. And what's worse is that this agenda is deliberately targeted towards the youth. And we discussed the invention of celebrated people, aka celebrities, and examined how these celebrated people all tend to promote the same movements and the same trends and social ideologies, and therein exposing themselves of being little more than musically proficient change agents, rather than actual creative artists who are honestly expressing themselves. And then in part two, I just lamented the reality that we are all part of a society that by and large worships these celebrated people, and the music that they produce. But it's worse than simply promoting a liberal narrative, because the real underlying message and intended influence that's being pushed by these so-called artists is a deliberately satanic one. And part two breaks down the evidence to substantiate this fact by centering around the life and influence of infamous dark magician and professed Satanist Aleister Crowley. So I won't waste any more time rehashing what we've already been over, but if you've been following this series, then that's a refresher for you. And if you haven't seen part 1 and 2, then I hope that I've intrigued you enough to drop everything and watch them both immediately, or maybe after this video. But anyways, that brings us up to speed, and here we are, in a society that is largely hypnotized by the enchantments of this satanic propaganda that's disguised as entertainment, Not even just entertainment, but inspiring entertainment, and entertainment that's meant to motivate and to change lives, if you listen to Disney. Entertainment which is conducted by people who are oftentimes open and practicing witches and occultists who specialize in hoodwinking others. And I just feel like I'm stuck in this dystopian world where I'm surrounded by screens and speakers that are constantly broadcasting the same propaganda, And it's not just your ordinary political propaganda, not just marketing propaganda, but it's this destructive and anti-human propaganda. And I think if you look at this stuff carefully and honestly, it's clear to see which target that this propaganda is aimed against. It's God as our creator and any semblance of traditional and moral righteousness. And even without the overt presence of blatant Satanism, which does exist in the entertainment industry, but even without that, this agenda would still be rightfully described as satanic, simply based on its outcome, and the effect that it has on society, which is, I think, irrefutably negative. How else would you describe a system that will openly hypnotize its subjects only to then bombard them with messages of self-destruction, And it's successfully and effectively transforming this world around us into the prophesied beast system, in my opinion. And it's happening right before our eyes. Just look outside. How many young people have covered their bodies now, and faces with tattoos, often depicting demonic symbolism, no less? Children walking around dressed like androgynous prostitutes. I've seen sweet old ladies that are wearing clothing or accessories that bear the image of skulls and crossbones, and everyone's just obsessed with this culture of death and destruction. Popular music, which was once brilliant and complex and beautiful, and which once evoked inspiration in the masses, has largely been replaced by this dumbed-down, hypnotic, and abrasive noise pollution that tends to revel in messages of sadness and anger. Alternatively, much of today's popular music is defined by its level of edginess or shock value. Rappers who boast of their violent crimes against others, or lyrics that depict sex in pornographic detail. And then rock music, which has become practically synonymous with the imagery of death, metal music, as much as I personally enjoy some of it, but you just can't deny how much metal music is obsessed with death. These album covers that you're seeing right now are just a small sample of some metal bands that are actually really popular and super famous. So if that says anything about the world that we're living in. These metal bands are an extreme example of this obsession with death, but really it is everywhere. The most popular shows on TV are true crime shows that detail events of murder and violence, and movies are no better. most commonly centered around themes of murder and violence, seduction and betrayal. Serial killers, that's the stuff that we like because we have this bloodlust, and I'm guilty of it too. But let's not deny it. And how about video games? I mean, when I was playing Nintendo 64 25 years ago, even back then, games were all based around the concept that for some reason or another, your character needs to go around killing people, because that's what's fun for us, I guess. It's a culture of death. I mean, you guys, even as I'm making this video, there are literally protesters raging in the city's streets outside, conducted by angry pro-choicers who are absolutely furious about the prospect that killing babies may soon be illegal in some states. They view humans as disposable. And why shouldn't they? They're born into a world that teaches you that from childhood, you are this soulless animal, just taking up space and threatening nature by your mere existence. And so we're conditioned to disrespect ourselves. We're taught that we're overpopulating the planet and we're just ruining everything. We're like parasites against Mother Nature. And monkeys, that's what they say that we came from. We evolved from monkeys, and we call our children kids, just like the name of this documentary, but that's really a name for a young goat. And so we send our little young goats off to schools that corrupt their innocent minds with anti-scientific nonsense designed to sow seeds of confusion into their ever so trusting minds. Confusion about their very identity, no less. And that was a generous way to word that, by the way. What I should have said is that we send our children off to indoctrination centers filled with perverted freaks who like to prey on the innocence of children. And all these kids are just talking about how many hookers they killed in Grand Theft Auto last night and whatever was on South Park, and they're listening to all this obscene music, which is marketed and targeted, to that particular age demographic. And everywhere they look, it's just a reinforcement of this same kind of satanic crap. And when it comes to what influences children in 2022, look no further than the very same trash that you see while you're surfing the internet or while you're flipping through YouTube or scanning through the radio. Because these days there's no barrier between what you see and what the kids see. This internet era has opened everything up and it's all right there out in the open. And even the worst and most extreme pornographic material that you could imagine is now being viewed by millions of kids, in the same way that you and me may have peeked at our grandparents' Playboy or something like that back when we were kids. I mean, just think about that. I'm in my mid-30s, and I'm sad to confess that after years of exposure to porn and violent media, and this kind of stuff, it's haunted my imagination, And even as a Christian to this day, I just can't unsee so much of what I've placed before my eyes over the years. And that's why it breaks my heart to consider the effects that are being incurred on the youth of today by this trash. Because the stuff that we once regarded as pornographic is now just, mainstream and acceptable by the new public standard. That's the kind of stuff that just gets passed around as a funny meme, by kids that are playing on their smartphones while sitting in class. Which, could you even imagine that, by the way? I remember I used to play with my calculator and try to pretend it was a video game, but kids these days actually have access to the internet and the, smartphones while they're sitting in class. But that's neither here nor there. But anyways, these music videos today, they're just chock full of all this sex and satanic symbolism. And this standard of today of what's acceptable when it comes to this kind of stuff is what, again, we used to regard as pornographic. Half-naked women and men alike are twerking on these videos against provocative backdrops. And even the lyrics of these popular songs are describing and celebrating the indulgence in every sin that you could imagine. And that spans all of these different genres of music, modern music, all the way to pop music, all the way to what you hear on Kids Bop CDs. And while a sane and competent society might cringe at the popularity of such unsophisticated trends as this, a satanic society that has been incrementally debased over years and generations, like ours, actually cheers and invites this mess into our lives, and we applaud these clowns and we beg for their autographs. And all these so-called stars are then promoted to the youth as figures that are worthy of worship, and they roll them out onto the stages of events like the Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards, where they're presented as acceptable role models, and they prance around in their designer clothes and their mini skirts, and they bask in the attention and praise that they receive from your children. But why shouldn't your children worship these people, and worship this system? Is this not the culture that we've modeled for them? Because when I was growing up, it was kind of a similar situation, at least in terms of the celebrity worship thing, with the rock stars always being on these elevated stages, towering above you, with lights shining at them while you just chant and cheer and just try to touch their clothes if you get close enough, like just practically worshiping these rock stars. That existed when I was young. When I was really young, it was like Michael Jordan and Hulk Hogan, those were my idols. But then as I got a little bit older and became a teenager, I traded out my old idols and got new ones, which were usually punk rockers, and underground rappers and these kinds of people. And that was sort of the route that I went, music. But other friends of mine chose to adopt athletes and movie stars as their new idols. But either way, in the end, we were all transitioned seamlessly from adolescence into adulthood without the system losing one moment of our undivided attention. But nobody ever wants to be labeled as brainwashed, though, myself included. We don't identify as sheeple or cattle, but we all act that way, just inserting ourselves into these pre-formatted categories, these secular categories and styles and subcultures that we can identify with, I mean, it was most annoying in my music days because I was surrounded by all these other aspiring rock star types who were also concerned with their public image and their insistence of their own importance. And the big catchphrases were always self-expression and individuality. By associating with these bands, and having the same piercings and tight pants and face tattoos, it was supposedly all about self-expression. Because, of course, there's no better way to express yourself than to dress and sing and behave like everybody else in whatever clique it is that you desire the acceptance of. And how could you possibly be more rebellious than to cover your arms in tattoos and get piercings all over the place just like every other rapper and rock star does? How original, and I don't know, it's just cringy to me as an artist how stuff like this passes for original when in reality it's all just variations of the same thing, because these modern genres of music have created actual subcultures. Like there's subcultures that are associated with a genre of music and we just accept that as a normal thing. Like, oh, that's a totally regular thing, and but clearly it's about a lot more than just music, it's about lifestyle. I mean, have you ever noticed how you can almost tell what type of music somebody listens to just based on the type of clothing that they wear? I mean, of course, there's exceptions to this, and there's also a lot of people who enjoy a wide variety of music styles, but just as a rule of thumb, the guy in a cowboy hat and his tucked-in flannel shirt is probably not the world's #1 Tupac fan, right? And the guy with the green mohawk and the nose ring that's got tattoos of demons up and down his arms is probably not into Dave Matthews Band. Everybody just happens to slightly resemble the celebrities that they like the most, Every genre of music seems to be accompanied with its own dress style to accommodate it. And I think that the truth is that the people of this fallen world are really just lost, like the Bible says, and while their preferences and tastes may certainly differ, what they're truly seeking is community. They don't want to be alone. But it's really sad, because these worldly styles are just man-made constructs. And in modern times, these secular styles end up kind of defining people's identity. People do find communities within these so-called music genres, but everything that comes along with a certain style. So it's like if you're into punk rock music, you're not just into punk rock music, you're probably also into skateboarding, and then by association, probably snowboarding, and you probably like old school hip hop too, because that's allowed by that standard, Whereas if you're really into country music, you're probably also really into the Second Amendment, and so on and so forth, but it's just like politics and sports and competition, and it's just like everything else. People don't actually want to embrace their individuality. People want to fit in. People certainly don't want to go against the grain. But I think the fact that these modern music styles have actually created these subcultures, and I shouldn't even say that they created them, in reality, I suppose this was probably always part of the same agenda, as is everything else. But in the end, when you have subcultures, when you have actual, cults practically, cultures of people associating themselves under the banner of, this band or this style of music, and they all take on a certain stylized way of dressing and acting and behaving. It's just all really cult-like, and it ranges from obvious to ridiculous. Whether it's a biker guy with his AC/DC shirt, or deadheads in their tie-dye shirts and their patchouli-drenched bandanas. Or how about juggalos, who are literally dressed like homicidal clowns? I mean, it's just crazy that it's this easy to control people But that is the reality of what's going on. It's not a coincidence that when the Beatles were popular, all the teenage boys on the streets of, every European country in America had haircuts just like the Beatles did. And the bizarre fashions and new styles that are donned by all these celebrities or celebrated people, 2 years later become what you see everybody wearing down the sidewalks, and that's how the influence works, and that's how the whole thing works. And it's just sad for me to accept that so many of these people around me in the fallen world are embracing these subcultures, but not just embracing them, they attach their identity to these subcultures. That's the key word, identity. That word is the key to understanding the true nature of this war on kids. There is indeed a war on kids. And I can't imagine a sadder statement than the one that I'm about to say. But Satan himself is using the systems of this world to entrap, corrupt, and destroy your children from within. This term identity will soon be used to dismantle your family. As your child sets out on his or her journey into the real world, they will be met by zealous recruiters at every corner. Zealous recruiters of every variation of Satanism, every variation of secularism and humanism. They represent every possible combination of sin and foolishness out there. But each will offer one similar promise: inclusion in a community, acceptance, a greater sense of identity, popularity, within those communities. And identity, that's like the most important thing. The word itself means the fact of being who or what a person or thing is. The fact of being who or what a person or thing is. At least that's what it means according to the dictionary. But according to your child's third grade teacher, identity means whatever you perceive yourself to be, or whatever you temporarily perceive yourself to be in this moment. And whether it's coming from the LGBT movement or the entertainment industry or right out of the mouths of your kids' teachers, children are being pulled in every direction from all these different points of influence that are all targeting them directly and trying to persuade them into some weird allegiance to the New World Order, an allegiance to humanism. But it's really more than that. We need to understand that this battle over identity, actually this battle over the very word identity and the definition of it, it's really a battle for souls. But what does the Bible say about our identity? Off the top of my head, I know the Bible says that we're all born into sin, and that when we were of the world, we identified with the things of this world, but when we accept God's gift of salvation, we have a new identity in Christ. Check out some of these verses. So now that I feel like I've sufficiently lambasted the credibility of the music industry and exposed it for the control mechanism that it actually is, I feel like this is a solid foundation to build on. Because sadly, music is only one small aspect of this greater agenda. So moving forward, this documentary series is going to enter some pretty dark places as I attempt to prove my case that our children are under direct assault by the very same forces that most parents invite and applaud. Music was a great launching pad because music is like a bridge, as they say, the universal language. Everybody's affected by music. And I think that more so than any other influence, music has probably served as the main catalyst which has invited so many of these satanic and negative and evil trends into our everyday life that we're surrounded by now. But I'm sad to report that the worst is still yet to come. There is a social fracture coming. The sides have been polarized almost beyond repair or rectification. And I believe that soon this world that you see outside your living room window will look a lot different. And this event will be politicized, but make no mistake, this war is not political, and it is spiritual. Our children are on the front line of this war, and most of us are dancing around on the battlefield like idiots who don't even understand that there's a war going on.